Alright, me darlings. So, it's now almost been 2 years since my most popular video has been released. Top 10 Roald Dahl books of all time. And, in honour of that, felt only necessary to go back to the Roald Dahl well once again with one of his best books, the BFG. And no, I do not mean this one. I've talked about the BFG loads of times before, but hell, let's talk about it some more because it's a great story. In 1982, Roald Dahl released onto the world one of his last kid books he would ever publish, the BFG, or The Big Friendly Giant to give it its full title. Inspired by the experiences he had with his granddaughter Sophie, the story of an orphaned girl who is taken in by a big friendly giant who go on adventures, catching dreams and fighting other giants, has endured for years and captured the hearts and minds of children and adults alike ever since its release, and remains one of the biggest Roald Dahl trademarks to this day. A few years later, in 1989, British animation studio Cosgrove-Hall, who were primarily known for their Danger Mouse and Duckula cartoons at the time, got the rights to make an animated movie based off the book, and while sadly it's dipped into obscurity nowadays, many people still remember this movie, and Roald Dahl himself stated just before he died that it was the only film adaptation of any one of his works that he actually enjoyed. Which, if that be the case, then it's a good thing he didn't live to see Fantastic Mr. Fox, because he would have hated that movie. For a while, this was the only film adaptation of the book, and many people never thought about the idea of there being another one at all. Well, enter Steven Spielberg and Disney to change all of that. In 2016, they came up with a live-action, well, about 50% live action really, adaptation of the movie, which was a much higher budget and scope compared to the Cosgrove one. Isn't that just the American way? Room with a view becomes room with the view of hell! The film was definitely different compared to the original, and while not a major critical success, the film did make a decent revenue, and many people still regard it as a great family movie. But there's a question that is yet to be answered here. Or even asked for that matter. Because I'm probably the only one that cares about it. But I do care, so I'm asking it anyway. Which is truly better? The 1989 Cosgrove version, or the 2016 Spielberg version? Well, it's time for me to engage in a new format to find out that exact answer. Yes, it's old versus new of the BFG.
That's me? Uncle Frank!
And before anybody comments, yes, I am very well aware that I'm stealing this format from Doug Walker, who popularised the old versus new format online. But let's be honest, other people have done this sort of video both before and after. And let's face it, when would he ever do an old versus new of the BFG? Warning, the following video does in fact include spoilers for both of these movies and the original novel. Also, be aware that any opinions given are simply that, opinions. They are not stated as fact. And with that, enjoy. So grab your snozcombers and frobscottle because we're about to get right into it. Which is truly the better adaptation? The 1980s animated fantasy? Or the 2016 CGI spectacular? Let's go. Well, feels only fitting to start off with the comparison of the main character and the character that's based off of Roald Dahl's granddaughter herself, Sophie. Now for this comparison, I'm not going to bother saying which one matches the actual Sophie Dahl herself, because that would be a bit pointless. No one really knows what she was like as a child besides her family, and comparing her to what she's like now would be...
powerful, sexy womanhood. Sexy food is food that is sort of without a fuss.
Kind of inappropriate.
Soup is not sexy.
So I'm just going to compare about how her character was like in the books and also what any additions they made to that character. The original Sophie was very much like a character from a Roald Dahl novel, a character who lived in an environment that is very harsh and mean that could force her to grow up fast like most kids from a Dahl novel like Charlie and James, but still have that wide-eyed curiosity and innocence that you get in actual children. But less of these fondoogled emojis and snappy chats that kids are into nowadays, that is. The animated version takes a more realistic bend on it. She acts very scared and panicky during the first act.
Please don't eat me. Oh, turkey. That's not a human being. It's a bird.
Which In fairness, it's not an unjustified reaction. I mean, a giant man has just kidnapped her from her home, and while it may have been a rubbish home, at least it was safe. Now she's in a world where just walking around could have her head get smashed in by something falling off a table, or have her fall to her death, or at the very least break her legs and spine, and there are 9 other giants running around that will eat her without even her touching the sides as she goes down. And the BFG thought it'd be safe to bring her here. Why exactly?
I does not go snitching things.
You snitched me?
So she seems very much like an actual kid, and makes her a great gateway character for the kid audience to relate to the film. I mean, think about it. It's as dangerous as being an immigrant in Peckham round this world, but unlike there, at least this place has got some cool stuff in it. Like that weird giant stripy mouse thing. What was with that thing anyway? I mean, I know kids' movies like to crowbar in silly comic relief, that still happens even today, but it almost seemed pointless having it there. It didn't do anything for the story. Actually, come to think of it, that does still happen today as well. But despite that, she is a little bland.
I know there's nothing in there.
I mean, yes, she does fill the observational role for the audience very well in this world, but there's only so many times you can have her say, "Wow!" and "That looks cool!" before it becomes boring, though her playful nature during some of the more quiet scenes is quite charming, despite some awkward and rather odd moments with her character, but I'll get into that in a minute. The 2016 version of Sophie, this time played by Ruby Barnhill of the 4 O'Clock Club fame, is a very different sort of character. Sophie in the 2016 version is actually a lot more like a Spielberg kid, acting a lot more adult than she would lead on.
You're bladdered, the lot of you.
Hello, little missy.
Don't little Missy me. I'll call the coppers, I will do it.
And has some sense of responsibility and wants to look out for those she cares for, and often heads out on her own without regard for her own safety.
You can't stop me. I've run away 1,000 times. I have instincts.
Instincts? I thought human beings was full of brains. You is not very clever.
And in all honesty, this actually makes her character a lot more interesting, as it's a lot more appealing to both kids and adults, and that's why the formula has worked for so many years in the Spielberg movies. And while the original version isn't bad by any means, she did feel like a bit of a damp squib sometimes.
You try it.
No, I can't. I don't know how.
You is never doing anything unless you try.
Can you really tell what the dream is just by listening to it? All I can hear is a sort of tinkling.
Which is understandable in this situation, but it is a very fantastical world, so sometimes having a protagonist that goes along with it more freely is a lot more fun, even if it is unrealistic.
Now to your foot! The other foot!
But then again, who says that a story involving giants catching dreams with a net and a drink that gives you more wind than a breakfast buffet has to be realistic? It's hard and weird to say that a character who strays a bit from the original book actually works better, but that doesn't mean that the original is a bad character. It just means that there are some different ways that you can do a character, and sometimes one of those different ways can just be as good or even a little bit better.
Not like it happens to me. I speak in the most terrible Wiglish.
Well, I think you speak beautifully.
Also, one major positive about Ruby Barnhill's version of Sophie, they didn't make her do this. Why? Why would you do that, Cosgrove? The major difference you can see between them in the movies comes down to the scene where they jump into Dream Country for the first time. The 89 Sophie is very anxious and isn't sure that she can do it. Barnhill does it straight away. It shows both the curiosity and excitement you have as a kid that would probably make you do something like that. Plus, if you go by the idea of the whole movie as a dream, and let's not forget there are many theories that suggest that this movie does take place within a dream, then it would also make sense since she would do something like that in a dream. Though if this is actually a dream, that means it has dreams within a dream. Did Inception rip off the BFG? Barnhill is someone who just knows exactly what to give to every one of the characters she plays to make them interesting, gripping, and great for both adults and children to watch, which is always great to see in child actors. Yeah, she's not exactly Corey Feldman, but at least she's not Short Round. Which is a shame, because I really wanted to see Short Round take a flying leap off a tall building. Though in that regard, did that scene remind anybody of the leap of faith bit from The Last Crusade? And they say Spielberg is running out of ideas. I can't see that at all. So personally, I prefer Barnhill just because she seems more of a gripping character and is a bit more developed. Sorry 89 Sophie, and whoever it was that played you. Actually, I'm going to look that up, see who it was. Amanda Root. Let's see, what else has she played? Lots of ITV miniseries, and a bit part in The Iron Lady. Well, at least you always had that weird out-of-nowhere music sequence in the middle of the movie that was sung by a woman who has never been identified. This movie's sort of like the Bermuda Triangle of Cosgrove-Hall animation, isn't it?
Not. Very rude.
But Sophie may be the main character, but we all know who the story is named after, which is kind of a no-brainer really. I mean, how many great stories can be told that are named after someone called Sophie? Point taken. Here's the comparison of the BFG. Now here we have a character that the book is named after, and quite so really. While Sophie provides the window for the kids to feel like they're a part of the story, the BFG is the one who really steals the show. Now much like Sophie, each version of this character is played in an entirely different way in their respective movie. But they're both good ways. The animated version has him really ecstatic and joyous pretty much every time he's on screen.
When you get a bottle of fabulous rum-scuttle bubbles and giggles, it's part of the plan. It's yummy and clubby and jiggles your tummy, and soon you're off with a whiz-boppy bang.
Kind of like a crazy fun uncle. That being one who's like that because he's probably been hitting too much of the happy sauce. Which technically the BFG does in the movies. But his enjoyment is very infectious, though his overenthusiasm does make him a tad creepy in the first act when we first meet him. But the jokes he makes are very funny, and he grows on you a lot.
What does you think human beings from Brazil taste of then?
Coffee?
Wrong. They taste of Brazil nuts. Swedes from Sweden is all tasting sweet and sour.
And it's so much fun seeing an upbeat character in a world that's surrounded by dark caves, cannibals, and stinky snozcumbers. Snozcumber is a word that's almost perfectly designed to sound disgusting. I get sick just saying the damn thing. Which does make me wonder what it must taste like.
It's like if all your friends got all their bogies together. Squeeze them inside a sausage.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And of course, voice actor David Jason does an amazing job as always.
Well, me, a BFG. I is going to be your mother, your father, and your auntie, and your uncle.
Fresh off the success of Cosgrove's other animated legends, Danger Mouse and Duckula, he once again does a performance that you can tell that he just loved doing in the recording studio, and puts on a voice that makes it very hard to tell that it's even him doing the voice. Which is probably for the best. I mean, could you imagine if the BFG sounded like Del Boy?
Oh, shut up, you tart. Some antibiotics. That is antibiotics. Got it? No, hang on, look, I'll write it down for you.
Jason definitely gives the BFG a personality just through his voice work that makes him enjoyable to watch, but even taking him out of it, he does have a very enjoyable personality. He's kooky, somewhat hyperactive, but he's got a big heart and he wouldn't dare hurt anyone, and you can tell that despite the difficulty he has in it, he just loves his life. Everything he does he just enjoys so much, even stuff he doesn't like, he has a big smile on his face whilst doing it, and it just makes him a great character to be around. But you could argue that it is a bit of a flaw for the story. The idea of the BFG is that a little girl comes into a giant's life and makes it all much better. So it seems like if he's so happy without her in his life already, why even bother having her around? But it's just a really minor nitpick in the grand scheme of things. He's still a great character to be around. The newer version, played by Mark Rylance, in quite the contrast, is much more subdued. He always seems very quiet, almost ashamed about what he did to Sophie.
Something the matter?
No, never mind.
And he's always being bossed around by her too.
You must take me.
Everything about you goes against all my better judgmentals, gal.
Well, I'm right about this one.
Which is actually pretty funny to see a 4-foot girl bossed around a 24-foot giant all the time. It's like if Lucy Porter married Greg Davis and she wore the pants in that relationship. Which actually I could see happening.
That is just against nature.
Buddy feels very much like a real, believable character. He's scared of the giants around him, though to be quite honest, I don't really know why. They're a bit of a joke. And is treated like dirt because of them, hence why he's just known as Runt by the other giants.
Is you at home, Runt?
Buddy loves his job so much that he just wants to stay around and keep doing it, so endures the pain because of that. Plus, giving him a bit more of a backstory this time.
There was a boy. He liked to read. He taught me how to read. You was wearing this little red jacket. I could have brought him back home. But then it'd be too late.
While a bit odd and out of nowhere, does actually work and allows for some great emotional up and downs in the story. And some great tributes to Quentin Blake and references to other Roald Dahl stories that come completely out of nowhere. Plus the BFG in this movie is likeable from the start, as opposed to coming off a bit creepy at first, though because of that he doesn't leave as much of an impact at the beginning, which is impressive for a character who looks like this, nor does he throughout the majority of the film sadly. He's nice and enjoyable, but he seems like a character who had a lot more potential to be likeable and fun to watch, but they wasted it a little bit. But to be fair, that's not what they were trying to make him. They wanted to make him to be sympathetic and even a rather tragic character who you root for rather than laugh at. And in the context of this story, that does work. But which is really better? Me personally, I prefer the old version. He feels a lot more fun to be around. Plus, he actually does feel like he's as old as the Earth. My favourite scene with him is where he's explaining how dreams work to Sophie, and his enthusiasm in telling her about it just makes you feel like he's been doing this for centuries.
Dreams is not like stories. Dream is more like pictures in books. If I was wanting to make a story, I have to mix up lots of dreams together.
The newer version acts like he's scared and surprised by everything he sees.
Because the first thing you'd be doing, you'd be scuttling around and yodeling the news that you were actually seeing a giant. You mean she actually sees me? No, not in a month of Mondays. What's that? What's that black stuff? What's that?
Which isn't a bad idea for a character, but that's kind of what we have Sophie for. Though I will give Rylance credit on one thing in that he does the gobblefunk or giant speak gimmick a lot more than Jason does.
And human being is like straw bunkles and cream to those giants out there. There's no such a twitch-tickling problem to me all my life. I knows exactly what words I want to say, but somehow or other they all comes out squiddled round. Telly bunkum box and a radio squeaker. Scrum diddly umptious.
Though you could argue that that's a positive or a negative anyway, depending on who you are. Some find it annoying, some find it charming. And if you're from Sussex, you understand every word he's saying fluently. Also, Rylance is a bit more developed than Jason. Like I said before, he does have a bit more of an explained history than him, and they tried to add more to his character.
I hears his lonely heart, just like I hears yours.
But most of the time he just looks sad and scared, and the scenes where he does look like he's enjoying himself, which are good scenes, are still not as infectiously fun as any scene when the Hogfather does them. Though that's probably because when I see this new BFG, I can't help but think that he's got the face of Hugh Dennis and the voice of my dad. Sorry guys, I can't help but think that. Though I will say one thing I never really quite understood about David Jason's BFG is why does he seem to be invisible when his cloak's on? Is that Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility he's got? If so, does that mean that this is in the Harry Potter universe? If so, does that mean that he knows Hagrid? I mean, giant, half giant. Maybe I'm just thinking a bit too much about this, but it is a bit of a weird addition, don't you think? But yeah, point goes to the old on this one. Sorry man, but you'll still always have your job on Mock the Week.
Excuse me? Would you mind handing me back my stumps?
But while Sophie and the BFG are entertaining on their own, when they're with other people they're even more hilarious and fun to watch. So let's get into the supporting cast of the BFG. Now the supporting cast is a tough thing to do for any adaptation of this story, since the first 2/3 focus so closely on Sophie and the BFG that once these guys are thrown in during the last act, you really have to make them stand out and enjoyable to watch. Not just so that we can strike up a fast connection with them, but also to make it seem less like a big 180 in the story, even though it does feel like that a lot of the time. Don't you deny it, you know that it feels like it comes out of nowhere. But in that regard, who could be more instantly recognisable and likeable than the Queen of England? And I'm sure that any of the Marxists, anarchists and Jeremy Corbyns that might watch my videos are probably typing in the comments right now saying why she isn't.
The Queen? Yes! Stand up when you say that. The Queen? Yes, and kneel down when you say that. No wonder she's so fucking unpopular.
Regardless, the Queen in the 1989 version is very much like how you would imagine her to be. Very prim, proper, unflappable, despite the bizarre situation she's been presented with.
I think, on the whole, I prefer the bagpipes.
But being the ruler of a country that has been invaded more times than a ram-raided off-licence in London street on a Saturday night, and has invaded 3 times as many more countries, you kind of stop being surprised by things, though it does seem to me that the Queen would have a large reaction to seeing a giant in her back garden. Oh! A giant in my back garden! Mind the geraniums, you big-footed twat!
Oh, Bullwinkles, what was that?
It was Louis XV.
Though a little girl on a windowsill shouldn't be that surprising, given that it isn't exactly hard to break into Buckingham Palace these days. I mean, considering when we saw Fathers for Justice on the roof of Buckingham Palace, this isn't that big of a surprise compared to that. I mean, yeah, a giant and a little girl is one thing, but Batman on your roof? That's weird. But yeah, she presents the character that you would expect her to be, but sadly that does make her a tad boring. And while the performance in the animation does do a great job of making it seem like the actual, well, as Newzoids would put it.
I'm the queen, I'm the vamp, I'm the bitch on all the stamps with a crown so heavy that my neck's got cramp.
Yes, her. It does seem like she just sits around and gives orders all the times, and that's all the character seems to do.
Would you summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force? You may call him. And Mrs. Clonkers can be their keeper.
Actually, maybe they got it down perfectly in that regard. What do you want from me? However, the Queen in the 2016 version, played by Harriet Jones herself no less,
Harriet Jones, former Prime Minister.
Now everyone really does know who she is. It's actually a more realistic portrayal of how you would imagine her to react in this situation. I know that might sound odd given that I said that the original Queen was what you would expect her to be, but there's a difference between what we want and what would happen, and in my opinion, this is how I would imagine the Queen would react in this situation.
This room is so gigantic, I needed binoculars and telescopes to see what's going on at either end.
Does he always talk like that?
Goodbye, Snozcumber.
What's Snozcumber?
It's this horrible stinky vegetable, and I'm afraid it's all he has to eat.
Doesn't seem to have stunted his growth at all.
And while Penelope Walton's performance is admittedly very good, it's kind of hard to disconnect her from being the actual Queen to just her doing a performance of the Queen. Which I know sounds odd, but when you watch a performance of someone who is so famous, you kind of want to just kind of disconnect your mind and think that it's actually her sitting there rather than just someone playing a role. But she does do a very good job anyway, and is very enjoyable to watch.
What is this horrible swig pill I was drinking, Magister?
Would he prefer tea?
It's hard to say who does do the better version of the Queen, since it's hard to think of how she would react in this situation. But I'm glad the movies took it in 2 different ways, but only one seems to be both more natural and funny. Plus her staff are more characterised in this version, and are given more funny things to do.
Your cape, sir.
What a wopsy, spliffling robe is it?
First off, we have Ralph Spall as Mr. Tibbs.
They call me Mr. Tibbs.
No, not that one, though that would actually be pretty cool, because there's a severe lack of minorities in this movie, and no, the giants don't count, even if there are only 10 of them. And he graces his performance with his ever-changing accent. Seriously, in this movie alone, he goes from American
Queen's Garden, rear window, please.
To English.
Stand down, gentlemen, please. Stand down.
To Scottish.
We will hold here.
To Irish.
He's magnificent, your giant.
Where does he come from? Well, anyway, he does have some good lines, and is fun to watch, since he does have a lot of his dad's magnetic acting ability. Plus, we also have Rebecca Hall as Mary, who is much more realistically portrayed in this movie. In the original, she just seemed like a more human version of Nanny from Duckula, which, if you saw my Danger Mouse review, you'll know that I can't stand that character. And even the bit part staff roles are given much more comedic opportunities in this movie, of which allows for the explanation of how the BFG got into the bloody palace in the first place.
That's it, sir. Slow ahead. Careful. Slow ahead.
Seriously, every version of the BFG I've ever seen and read, I've always asked that question, but now I finally have an answer. Now if someone can explain to me how Oompa Loompas reproduce when they're only male, and why everyone wants to stop asking me why the Twits wasn't on my top 10 Roald Dahl list, then I can finally complete my nitpicker's treatment reward card. The expansion and further characterization of the characters introduced in the third act of the story is much better in the 2016 version, though sadly we are not given the great immature battle of wits between the head of the army and the Air Force from the 89 version.
Strategy is quite simple, Your Majesty. Tanks. Tanks? Nonsense. Bombs. Bombs? Ridiculous. Tanks. And heavy artillery. Artillery? Piffle. Next thing you'll be wanting belly cavalry too. Tanks, artillery, and cavalry. Low-level assault bombers. High explosive bombs. Heat-seeking rockets. Sub them up with bombardment. Roll in the tanks. And pick them off with machine guns.
And what you've just seen there is probably the greatest representation of how Trump and Putin are discussing how to deal with North Korea. Sadly, the generals have little to no character in the 2016 version, other than joining in with the Whiz Popper Symphony, which, to this day, I'm not sure if it's a brilliantly hilarious or stupidly droll scene, but it is definitely something that makes these characters more memorable at the very least. Though speaking of which, did anyone know that Max Headroom is in this movie? But yeah, a bit quicker in this section, but with the little we're given with these side characters, that's kind of what you get. This time it goes to the new.
To giant country.
But here is a one thing, a good adventure is never complete without good villains, so let's get into ours right now. Unlike the last 3 rounds, this one's going to be easy. When it comes to the other giants, one movie nails it and the other one just ruins them. And I'll give you one guess in which movie did them better. What is wrong with you people? No, in fact, the original giants are way better.
Where you think you're going, huh? It's not dark yet. I'll let you go this time.
And while they're not seen as often as the 2016 ones, though given the way they did those giants, that's probably for the better. You know just by looking at them that they are not to be trifled with, and they are scarier looking than Godzilla, King Kong, and the Head from Art Attack combined.
You show him the way. You is not giant. You is like human being.
Plus, unlike the 2016 version, more than one of the giants is more fleshed out than the others. In this one, 2 of them are more fleshed out. Okay, it might seem a bit trivial, but at least it's not just Flesh Lumpita that's given more personality and interaction with the BFG. Plus, Blood Bottler is a hilarious character.
You've been talking in here at smell human being. Gimme, come on. Eat him! Crunch his bones up, yeah!
See, Spielberg? That is how you make a villain scary and funny at the same time. The original giants are just perfectly done. They're just how you would imagine them to be. Intimidating, threatening, occasionally funny, but their presence gives a big foreboding sense of dread throughout the whole movie. They seem very much like real monsters and are only barely able to talk, and they cannot be reasoned with. Which is definitely not the case with the 2016 version, since a villain faction can't be taken very seriously when you see one of them getting whacked in the nuts. Seriously, of all things I would have never expected to see in a Roald Dahl movie, that one is probably number 1. That or Johnny Depp as Willy Wonka. Though I've said this many a time before, I'll say it again anyway, Jermaine Clement does a fantastic job as FLE in the 2016 version, like he does with any of his villain roles.
Why is you such a chatbag in the morning?
Why is you not sleeping today?
Because you keep me awake with your jabbering. He find the last one. I find this one. I is always hungry.
Though he's still mostly played for laughs.
I tell you, I was guzzling that wonderveds gleefully night and day.
Well, that's what's wrong with you.
His perfectly done over-the-top voice work does make him very amusing, and his design makes him look somewhat intimidating, but also kind of funny. That, and bizarrely, it looks a lot like him. Why does every villain Jermaine Clement plays always look like him? He is a delight to see, despite his more pathetic nature.
I had the boo-boo.
Oh, possibly later.
Plus, he seems to be the only one of the giants who is aware of his evil ways and enjoys it, whereas the others seem to be more like misguided children.
You is a cannibal! Oh, it's bad!
Not to mention, they make for what is probably the most disappointing of climaxes in 2016, and I'm including both the presidential and referendum elections in that list. Political jokes, forever splitting the audience and making the guy that said them look like a twat. Also, why are they afraid of water? That was never a thing in the book. Water and fire. I guess Spielberg got them mixed up with Frankenstein's monster, but he would be way scarier than these guys. Hell, Frankenberry and young Frankenstein would be scarier than these guys. I get the idea that it was probably made so they would be less intimidating and scary for younger children, but you, Mr. Spielberg, have made an entire career over scaring children for years, and this is where you relent? What sense does that make?
Those days are over.
Just one last thing I'll complain about here, as if I haven't dug the grave for these guys 50 feet deep already. Which, to be fair, for some of them that's actually not deep enough, so I better keep going. Besides Flesh Lump Peter, their designs are really generic and boring. They all just kind of look the same. And while the motion capture on their faces is actually really good, they don't really look all that different or even interesting. All the giants in the 1989 movie look distinct, scary and original, particularly Flesh Lump Peter, who I regard as having one of the most terrifying designs of any villain from the 80s. Jenna, Freddy, Mum-Ra, The Thing, Angela from Sleepaway Camp, 80s Donald Trump, this guy could take down all of them. And that's not just me being a fanboy. All he'd have to do is step on any one of those guys and they'd be down for the count. Though I suppose the BFG did beat him with a dream in the end, so I guess Freddy could stand a chance. Hey, maybe FLE will be one of the new characters in Terrordrome too. Speaking of which, I'm really disappointed that the new movie left out the detail of the greatest fear of giants being Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk. It was both a really funny bit and a great reference to the classic story. But that's a minor nitpick really. Even the 80s movie only mentions it in a throwaway line.
But what was it a dream about?
It's about Jack.
Jack?
Jack is the only thing giants is frightened of. He's a famous and terrible giant killer.
Besides, after this movie, no one's taken Jack seriously again. Or that movie either. But now that I've gotten my rant about the new giants out of the way, they can go back to frolicking on Orkney or whatever they were dropped off at, and I never have to hear about them again. Unless there's a sequel on the way. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was. I don't want there to be, but it's Spielberg and Disney. They're gonna make a sequel if they have the opportunity. But the old wins on this one. Sorry, Jermaine.
I has no regrets.
And now we get to the thing that ties the whole thing together, the story. So who wins the final point? Let's find out. As I've said before, the story itself feels a lot like a dream as we go through it. That and the story and the narrative take a complete 180 in the third act with it. It creates a story that is very hard to adapt into a film. So, how did these ones handle it differently? For starters, in terms of design and cinematography, both movies have a great amount of atmosphere, but they do it in different ways. The 2016 one has the inside environments very busy and almost constantly moving, whereas the outsides are wide, bright, and very mystical in nature, particularly the Dream Country, which is the best part of the movie. The 1989 version has the whole thing feel very enclosed and somewhat dark, but while it may sound very dreary, it does kind of fit the environment that you would see in a dream. In a dream, you don't see much of the outside of where you are, and most people don't dream in colour, so it would look like this. Plus you have to consider the animation limitations, which is probably more why it looks like that, which is a good way to maneuver around limitations whilst also being creative and distinct at the same time. The 89 one also has a lot more creativity in its designs, not just for the giants but for the environments as well. The Dream Tree idea in the 2016 one is really cool, but I really love the idea of the Dream Country being this sort of outer space alternate dimension idea. It feels very 80s sci-fi fantasy, particularly with that odd pop song that comes out of nowhere. Though it is still very enjoyable and even reminds me of the Linda McCartney music video The Oriental Nightfish, and it looks amazing, and it still makes me feel like I'm in another world when I'm watching it. Also, there seems to be a lot more mystery when watching the 89 version as well. The darkness and limited view make it seem like there's so much more that we're not seeing, and it allows your imagination to fill in the blanks, much like if you were reading a book. But the stuff you do see is creative and unique enough that it still gives you an idea of what this world could be like. The 2016 environment seems as if you can see everything from just a big wide view, which is okay, but it does take the mystery away from it. And besides the Dream Country, it all seems like our world just bigger, which isn't really that interesting. I mean, it does look nice, and the idea of using large objects from the real world as household appliances and other things in the giant world is a very clever idea, but it does just make it seem as if I'm watching the Flintstones rather than the BFG with that, though admittedly the animation on the Dreams is amazing. But setting is one thing, narrative is another, and to be honest, both versions do feel very different as well in that regard. I mean, the pacing is definitely going to be different since one movie is much longer than the other, but the original feels a lot more natural in its progression, like it's less of a flowing story but more like we're moving on from one scenario to another. But that actually does work in this movie's advantage. Like I said, it does actually feel a lot like an actual dream when you're watching the movie, and that's what dreams are like. They don't always go in a straight line and they don't always feel natural, but they still feel magical and have that sense of wonder that we all know and love. The 2016 version has elements where it tries to more obviously imply that it's just a dream, Wizard of Oz style, by having some of the themes and elements that will be big parts of the story pop up in the first 10 minutes, which says Spielberg all over it, and it comes off as really tacky and hokey. On top of that, there are some points in the story that just don't seem right. Like there's a scene where the BFG gives Sophie a nightmare to stop her from running away, and it feels very out of nowhere and rather cruel for him to do, even by his standards. And like I said earlier, the climax is one of the shortest and most disappointing I've ever seen in the movie. It's like the writer just got to that point and thought, oh shit, I've got 5 more pages and I'm over my limit, better wrap things up fast. Granted, the ending of the BFG is a bit abrupt anyway, but the more you can add to it, the better in my opinion. The 89 climax is a ton of fun. It's suspenseful, we see more of the giant country, FLE is hunting down Sophie, things are getting destroyed, and it's just a great final outing. There is a scene in the middle of the 2016 version that's like that, and it is very good, but it's not as good as if they had it saved for the ending. But the biggest problem with the 2016 version is that it doesn't seem very clear on what kind of story it wants to tell, whether it's a story about standing up and doing the right thing, about family and friendship, about being brave in the face of great fear, about being a fun adventure. It just seems very confused, and almost like an early draft of the full script was the one they chose to make this movie. And I know I might be looking into this too deeply, as both the book and the 89 movie make it very clear that it's just supposed to be a story about being brave and going on fun adventures. The new movie adds all those Spielbergian and Disney traits, and it just makes it seem like there is a message in there, but you have to hunt for it a bit. But when you do hunt for it, you're not really sure where it's supposed to be, and that really brings the movie down, and it does make it a big problem to watch, not just for kids but for adults as well. Disney might be hit and miss at times, but they do make it very clear what each and every one of their movies is supposed to say. When you take a story that already has a purpose and then try and add another purpose to it to try and make it your own, it just makes it all very confused. So overall, the 2016 one does have a very watchable story and is a very enjoyable movie, but it comes off as a very inconsistent in lots of areas, and the story can be a bit choppy in some scenes that just come out of nowhere and can really be a big turn off. Whereas the 1989 version, while it does have a few flaws, stays very consistent throughout the whole movie in everything: its story, its characters, its identity, and especially in what it wants to tell. It just makes it while not a fantastic movie, still a great adaptation of one of the greatest children's books of all time. So in the nutshell, I think the 1989 version wins out here, and while both movies definitely have their flaws, the 89 one just has more stuff in it that makes it entertaining, charming, magical, and captures the feel of the original Roald Dahl story. And given that at the time of its release it was the only movie of his works that he admitted to liking, that says a lot. So the winner of this round, and overall, is the Cosgrove-Hall version.
Is you sure?
Oh, I am very sure, BFG. You are the undisputed winner of this old versus new.
Well, let's be going home then. We had dreams waiting for us.
Sorry Spielberg, you tried your best, but this movie just got it down better. But personally I feel that the BFG is a story you can never really do badly. So long as you hand it to the right person, because to be quite honest, I could have seen M. Night Shyamalan doing this movie before Spielberg. I mean, it's got everything that he likes in it. Nonsensical plot, ridiculous dialogue, and the chance to put in some backwards ham-fisted philosophy. So let's just thank our lucky stars every day that he didn't do the BFG. But now, I've had enough of this, I'm going on the other side to